Investigators grapple with the case of a sexual sadist who's leaving behind painfully few clues. Even his victim is anonymous. When a woman steps out of her house and vanishes, detectives find evidence that she's never coming back. With no body, no witnesses, and scant clues, the truth about her fate hangs by a hair. A hideous crime comes to light in a remote river, but all evidence has been washed clean. Investigators have no hope of solving it unless the murderer strikes again. Greed, rage, and revenge provide most killers motivation, but some hunt just for sport. To catch these murderers, investigators must follow a trail of scattered clues. Beneath the gaze of California's Sierra Nevada mountains lies the resort community of Lake Tahoe. Clean air and majestic forests instill a sense of harmony. But for one lost traveler, this was the cruelest place on earth. On September 17, 1987, investigators from the El Dorado County Sheriff's Department were called to an isolated spot off the side of an abandoned service road. The young woman had been gagged with a scrap of pantyhose. Investigators found what they believed to be the murder weapon, a strangulation device made from a tree branch and a shred of the victim's clothing that appeared cut with scissors. Unlike a rope or bare hands, a garrote is primarily used for torture. The killer went to a good deal of trouble to find a place to stage his lengthy assault. Sergeant Jim Watson was surprised to find a body in such a remote spot.
And at that point, it was just a big question mark in my mind. How did she get here? Where did she come from? A lot of unanswered questions at that point, but it was where we started.
What they did know was that the killer must have picked this location ahead of time. The remote service road was hard to find, not a place one simply stumbled upon. And it wasn't chosen merely as a place to dump a body. The path was too steep for carrying the victim. The absence of injury to the soles of her feet told detectives that her shoes weren't removed until she was walked down here. Working outward in a spiral pattern, they scoured the ground for additional clues.
We began a sweep of the entire area from here up to the highway, which is about a third of a mile. That sweep revealed pieces of clothing that were scattered on various bushes and trees from here up to the main highway.
Technicians collected what they believed to be the remains of the victim's outfit: a dress, a pair of underwear, a single shoe, and pantyhose remnants. Not knowing what might be of use later, they also collected a pack of cigarettes and a butane lighter. Some white cord found nearby suggested that the killer restrained his victim before he killed her. Detectives had no clue to the victim's identity, nor any solid leads on her killer. They hoped the medical examiner would give them something they could use. The post-mortem examination placed her between the ages of 16 and 21. She had a large contusion on her head, but that wasn't the fatal injury. The ligature around her neck had ended her life. Based on the amount of decay, the medical examiner estimated that she had died 2 to 4 weeks earlier. No tissue was found under her fingernails. No foreign fluids were found on her body. Technicians used sticky tape to pick up trace fibers from textiles. They processed every square inch of the victim's clothing and cataloged each shred in the hopes that one day they'd find a source of comparison. But without a suspect, this trace evidence was useless. And until they could identify the victim, the murder investigation was at a standstill. A sadistic predator was free to roam and to kill again. Detectives scoured hundreds of missing persons records, but to no avail. The papers published an artist's rendering of the dead woman. Tips poured in from families and friends searching for missing teenage girls. One by one, each was eliminated. There was nothing to do but wait. As months passed, the missing persons search gradually spread up the coast. It wasn't until 4 months later, in January 1988, that police got a call from a Seattle woman who recognized the girl. Dental records finally gave the victim a name. 17-year-old Darcy Frackenpole was a runaway from Seattle who tried to build a life in Sacramento. She ended up working as a prostitute. Friends last saw her on August 24th, 3 weeks before her body was found. For a predator looking to kill, prostitutes make easy targets. Night after night, they let strangers drive them into the darkness. Sometimes they don't come back. Investigators looked for similar attacks on prostitutes in the Sacramento area. One caught their attention. 3 days before Darcy's body was found, another prostitute had a brutal run-in with a customer. While leaning over to lock the door, the man grabbed her wrists and attempted to handcuff her. But before he managed to subdue her, a police officer cruising in the neighborhood noticed the struggling couple and interceded. After the prostitute escaped from the car, the perpetrator tried to bolt, but he was caught.
Put your hands out the window. Out the window. Open the door. Slowly. Keep your hands in the air, face the building, walk backward.
One good look at a bag found on his back seat told police that the prostitute had gotten away just in time. It contained a pair of scissors, handcuffs, and a garrote assembled from 2 wooden dowels and a length of white cord. It seemed to be some sort of crime kit. Police arrested the suspect, 48-year-old Roger Kibbe. A furniture maker by trade, Kibbe had a burglary record that spanned 2 decades. Illiterate but intelligent, acquaintances described him as a quiet man who liked to take long drives at night. He was given an 8-month sentence for assaulting the prostitute. While he was in prison, Darcy Frackenpole had been identified in Lake Tahoe, over 80 miles away, and the hunt was on for her killer. Kibbe's attack on the prostitute in Sacramento and his crime kit gave investigators the haunting suspicion that this wasn't his first strike. They didn't know how many women had made the mistake of climbing into Kibbe's passenger seat. They wondered if Frackenpole was one of them. A garrote is an unusual and memorable weapon. Though the one found in Kibbe's crime kit didn't resemble the makeshift device used to kill Frackenpole, The white cord used in its construction resembled the rope found at her murder scene. And like his assault victim in Sacramento, Frackenpole was a prostitute. Investigators questioned him, hoping that he would incriminate himself in the Frackenpole murder. He denied any involvement. Detectives' suspicions were purely circumstantial. The only thing they had to go on was the nylon cord. It deserved a closer look. Under the magnification of a stereo microscope, technicians compared the cord samples from both Frackenpole's murder scene and Kibbe's car. Both strands contained the same number of fibers, made up of the same weave and pattern. Investigators discovered that this wasn't just household rope. It was parachute cord. They learned that Kibbe worked at a storage facility and rented a unit there. They obtained a warrant to search it.
Oh yeah, right there. It's a skydiving certificate for Roger.
They learned that he enjoyed skydiving, and when they removed a photograph from the wall, they made an unexpected discovery. The picture was hanging from a length of parachute cord, exactly like that found at both crime scenes. But it was hardly a smoking gun. Investigators found nothing to definitively link Kibbe to the death of Darcy Frackenpole. This relatively common rope would not support the weight of a murder investigation. Unless they found more evidence, Kibbe would be out of prison in just a few months, and then would probably disappear. But tiny fibers might prove stronger than sturdy cord. Now that investigators had a suspect, they could compare the trace evidence originally collected from Frackenpole's clothing to fibers collected from Kibbe.
There are many serial type crimes that we don't have blood analysis or DNA analysis, and if there's not bullets or blood or semen, we have no other option other than to look at the particulate or the trace evidence.
At the California Department of Justice Crime Lab, criminalist Faye Springer scrutinized the numerous fiber lifts taken from Darcy Frackenpole's clothing. Hours can be spent analyzing 1 square inch. After 3 weeks poring over the evidence, Springer found 2 fibers that stood out because of their larger size. The distinct shape and color of the fiber's cross-section told her that they were fibers from a blue nylon carpet. Here's where her 30 years' experience paid off. She asked investigators to find out what kind of car Kibbe had been driving at the time of the assault. A search warrant was executed, and the suspect's car was taken in for inspection. Springer was on target. The floor mats were blue. What's more, one had a red stain on it. A sample was collected and sent for testing. The results were disappointing. It turned out to be pink. But the blue fibers from Kibbe's car still had forensic value. A sample was compared with the fibers found on the victim's clothing. Not only were the shape and composition of the strands the same, a spectral dye analysis confirmed that they were exactly the same color. Was this proof that Darcy Frackenpole was in Kibbe's vehicle? Not quite. The same blue carpeting could be found in tens of thousands of vehicles. If investigators were going to catch Kibbe, they'd need something more conclusive. But one strange similarity couldn't be accounted for. Both the fibers from the car and the ones from the victim's clothing were peppered with tiny football-shaped specks. Samples of both were sent to a lab in Chicago that specializes in identifying microscopic contaminants. Until the results came back, investigators had no other evidence beside the parachute cord. As they began their careful scrutiny for something they might have overlooked, they realized that Kibbe might have left behind just enough rope to hang himself. In California, criminalist Faye Springer was trying to use 3 lengths of rope to lasso a killer. She examined the ropes under higher and higher magnification until she noticed something strange. The rope found at the Darcy Frackenpole murder scene had tiny red paint flecks in it. So did the cord from the garrote found in Roger Kibbe's car. So did the sample from his storage unit. Spectral analysis showed that the paint on the 3 cords had the same chemical composition, including some microscopic black specks that must have gotten trapped beneath the drying paint. It was a powerful connection.
So it looked like not only did we have the same kind of cordage, but we had cordage that lived or existed in the same environment, was exposed to the same kind of contaminants.
For all intents and purposes, it was the same rope. But investigators needed more to tie up their case. That's when the call came from the testing lab in Chicago. They had finished analyzing the carpet fibers. The unidentified football shapes found on the carpet fibers were fungal spores, single-celled organisms that could have come from dirt or mold. But there was something else. The lab's powerful microscopes had identified a red spot on the carpet fiber found on the victim's clothes. It was paint. It had the same properties as the paint on the floor mat of Kibbe's car. The carpet fibers weren't just similar, they were identical. Both contained the same football-shaped fungal spores and the same paint stains. The victim and suspect had now been irrefutably linked.
What about the other one there?
Roger Kibbe was arrested on April 25, 1988, for the murder of Darcy Frackenpole. By trial time, police had pieced together the details of the victim's last night. She had been working the streets when she accepted an invitation that would turn out to be a date with death. Investigators suspect that after restraining her with the parachute cord, Kibbe brought her to a place he'd selected in advance. After cutting up her clothing and torturing her for several hours, he killed her, then scattered her clothes. Roger Kibbe was found guilty of murder in the first degree and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. No one knows how many other victims met a fate similar to Darcy Frackenpole's. At least 3 other murders matching Roger Kibbe's MO are thought to be his work. Had it not been for a powerful microscope and some shrewd detective work, the number might still be rising. Roger Kibbe had covered his tracks by heading out in search of strangers. But not all predators hunt far from home. On a brisk October morning in 1992, neighbors saw Laura Hoteling leave the Bethesda, Maryland home that she shared with her mother. The 24-year-old Harvard graduate moved back after college and had no trouble finding a job at a consulting firm. But on this day, she never made it to work. A close friend and colleague went to check on her. Though the back door was open, she found the house empty.
Anyone home? Laura? Laura? Someone didn't come to work today.
There was no sign of Laura, nor any hint about where she'd gone.
Laura, I know you're here.
She contacted Laura's family, concerned that there was some sort of emergency. They were as puzzled as her friend. Laura's mother cut her business trip short. Neither she nor her son had any idea where Laura could be. She was not the type to run off without leaving word. Serious about her career, Laura was known for her diligence and punctuality. No burdensome secret seemed to be weighing on her mind. She didn't hint about leaving town. Her family filed a missing persons report with the Montgomery County Police. At this point, all Detective Ed Tarney could do was a routine check.
We checked with the friends. They had not heard from her. She did not leave a note. It was just very suspicious. We also, through the course of the investigation, we checked all her credit cards, bank accounts. There had been no activity.
But as missing persons cases go, this was in its infancy. It had only been a few days since Laura Hoteling was last seen. Though there had been no sign of her, there hadn't been any indication of foul play either.
Hey, how's it going, pal?
Good.
Police
good. How are you?
interviewed the Hotelings' friends, their neighbors, their gardener.
Hi, nice to meet you.
I wonder if you'd,
No one could offer any information regarding the woman's disappearance.
you seen her lately?
No.
After seeing her leave for work the previous morning, there'd been no sign of Laura, nor any indication of trouble at her house. But then, as they searched the woods around the house, investigators found something that told them this was more than a missing persons case. The pillowcase and pillow inside it were stained with what appeared to be blood.
When we took the bloody pillowcase back to the house, it matched up with the other pillowcases that were there. And at that time, we knew we had something very, very serious.
To find out more about the stains, investigators turned to forensic scientist Susan Ballou at the Montgomery County Crime Lab.
I take the pillowcase off the pillow.
Okay.
Ballou
Get the
first
pillow?
tested the stains to confirm that they were made by human blood.
We wanted to see if we could pick up a type consistent with Laura. We knew from her donations to the Red Cross facility that she was a type A blood.
The blood stain from the pillow was shown to be of the same type. From its bright red color, Ballou knew that she was looking at stains less than a week old. Though her findings could only prove that someone with type A blood had bled on Laura Hoteling's bedroom pillow, it was enough to turn the missing persons case into a potential homicide. Investigators needed to find out what had happened in Laura's room. Beneath the bedspread, they found something strange. There was a flat sheet on the bed, but the fitted sheet was gone. And on the mattress underneath were some faint stains that looked like more blood. Investigators saturated the mattress with a chemical called luminol. When it combines with blood proteins, even those invisible to the naked eye, it glows. Viewed in the dark, Laura's mattress radiated a pattern of blood spots and streaks that spelled murder.
There was a large quantity of blood that showed up on that bed. That's when we knew she had probably been murdered there in her bedroom.
The lack of spatter on the surrounding walls or furniture told detectives that the killer had used the pillow to staunch the blood flow. The absence of a blood trail leading from the bedroom suggested that the killer had either cleaned his tracks or wrapped the body before removing it from the house. Investigators collected fibers and samples of Laura's hair in case they ever had the need to make a comparison. Meantime, technicians searched the pillowcase for any link to the suspect. A crucial detail surfaced. Based on the repeated pattern of triangular smears, they surmised that the killer had stabbed the victim with a narrow, pointed weapon, which was then wiped on the fabric. Hidden in the corner of the pillowcase, Ballou uncovered a more significant discovery.
And when I looked at these areas closely, I could see partial impressions of prints on them, which turned out to be what's called a patent print, a print that is made in blood. However, there was not sufficient ridge detail to get enough information from it.
In its current state, the print was too vague to be used for identification. But criminalists like Ballou have ways of turning faint prints into glaring evidence. She applied a protein-sensitive dye to enhance the pattern.
Let's see what we can do with it.
Now that they had a viable print, all they needed was a suspect.
Hold this here so I can rinse some more.
Mrs. Hoteling couldn't think of anyone who would want to harm her daughter. She did recall, though, that their gardener, Haddon Clark, had been fascinated by Laura since his first day on the job. She also told police that she'd discovered her spare key was missing. Clark had worked for the family for several months. During the day, he was allowed in to use their bathroom or help himself to some coffee. Overnight, he lived out of a truck that he kept in a nearby church parking lot.
How long have you been working for the hotel?
Though Clark denied any knowledge of an attack on Laura Hoteling, his agitated behavior cast him in doubt. It wasn't Clark's first brush with the law. He had once been arrested on a burglary charge. When Clark's prints were compared against the patent print from the pillowcase, they matched. The suspicious gardener had left his print in wet blood on the victim's bedroom pillow. And the only way he could have done that, police contended, was if he had killed her. Though they still had no body, police arrested Clark on November 6, 1992. Inside his truck, along with his gardening tools, they found a hardware store receipt for carpenter's twine, duct tape, and plastic sheeting. Ordinarily harmless materials that homicide investigators see more than their share of. Detectives believed that Clark was the killer. Proving it would be another matter. Despite the circumstantial evidence heaped against him, all police had was a bloody fingerprint. Clark's lawyers were already formulating their rebuttal. The homeless man regularly scavenged through trash in the woods. He could have easily left an innocent fingerprint on the pillowcase. It was up to the prosecution to prove otherwise.
So at that point, we realized the fingerprint was not going to be the crux of this particular case, and we had to go further.
Despite his dubious profile, detectives didn't have a single shred of physical evidence to tie Clark to the murder. And without a body, the case would be nearly impossible to prove. Investigators searched Clark's squalid campsite for a weapon, or even a body, but no weapons were found. And the only bodies were the game he trapped for food. Detectives began to scour the place for tinier clues to prove Laura had been there, but realized that finding anything of value in this hovel would be impossible. The trial date was just weeks away. If the prosecution failed to convince a jury of Clark's guilt, they wouldn't be able to try him again, even if the body turned up later. And without any convincing evidence, it seemed their case against the gardener would wither on the vine. The trial date was drawing near, and Maryland investigators needed to find some physical link between Haddon Clark and the victim, Laura Hoteling. Because the victim's body hadn't been found, the case would have to hinge on other evidence. Investigators were at a loss to determine what that evidence might be. While they searched the suspect's belongings, forensic technician Susan Ballou continued processing the evidence from the crime scene. In preparation for any possible hair comparison, Ballou inspected more than 90 hairs taken from the victim's hairbrush and made a shocking discovery.
When I started to do that, I noticed that one of the fibers I put under the microscope was a wig fiber. And it just jumps out at you. It is so different from an actual hair, and it caught me off guard. May I speak to Ed Tarney, please?
Ballou learned that none of the victim's family or friends owned or wore wigs. From receipts found in Clark's truck, investigators learned of a storage facility that he rented in Rhode Island. Investigators realized that his penchant for dressing up might be the one thing that could finally expose him.
Ed, what do you have?
If technicians could prove that the single wig fiber found in the victim's brush had come from one of the suspect's wigs, they would be able to show that he had been at the scene of the crime, disguised. Ballou pulled sample hair fibers from each of the 24 wigs and compared them to the single wig fiber found in the victim's hairbrush.
After looking at under the microscope at all the different fibers from these wigs, I found one wig that the fiber from that wig had the same color composition, the same diameter. It also had the same internal characteristics as that one wig fiber that I recovered from that hairbrush.
Now that Ballou had narrowed her search to one wig, she sent it with the original strand to a crime lab that specializes in hair testing. The last and most definitive test would compare the dyes in both samples. Though indistinguishable to the human eye, each wig manufactured in the U.S. has a unique fingerprint. Each of the approximately 7,000 commercial dyes is trademarked by the company that formulated it. The lab studied the samples under a microscope sensitive to ultraviolet rays. They called Ballou with their findings.
They were able to determine that that dye content in the wig, as well as that question fiber recovered from the brush, were in fact one and the same.
Clark's defense attorneys couldn't get around this single strand of hair. Realizing he couldn't skirt the evidence, Clark confessed. He plea bargained to murder in the second degree. In exchange for the reduced charge, he agreed to reveal Laura Hoteling's grave, located near his campsite. Clark admitted to having stabbed the victim with a pair of scissors. The autopsy concluded she was also suffocated. Ultimately, investigators pieced together her final hour. Driven by sick obsession, Clark learned that his victim would be alone while her mother was out of town. Using the spare key, he entered the house, smothered Hoteling with a pillow, then stabbed her in the neck. Clark must have rolled the body in the missing bedsheet, then wrapped it with the plastic and tape he'd purchased from the hardware store. He loaded the body in the truck and drove to a clearing near his campsite, where a shallow grave awaited. The following morning, Clark returned to the scene of the crime to clean up and cover his tracks. He figured that by posing as Laura Hoteling, he'd throw any nosy neighbors off his track. His last look in the mirror would prove his undoing. Without the ironclad forensic case against him, Clark probably would have never confessed. His victim's body might still be lying in a lonely grave, and Haddon Clark might have extended his killing streak. Thankfully, the devious killer couldn't escape the evidence. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison.
Please hurry, he's trying to kill me.
There's no telling where a trail of evidence might lead. Sometimes investigators stumble onto more than they bargained for. At 4:30 a.m. on January 21st, 1995, the Marion County, Oregon police received a phone call from a prostitute named Lisa Louise Benson, who claimed to have been attacked. Benson was brought to the hospital for treatment. Lieutenant Bob Stye questioned her about the terrifying ordeal.
She had ligature marks across her neck and also had an abrasion and the signs of bruising on the back of her neck, and had abrasions on her hands and up on her knees.
Her injuries were photographed as evidence. Earlier that morning, she told investigators a customer had tried to kill her. She'd never seen the man before, but he didn't appear threatening. She climbed into his truck. He brought Benson to a retail carpet outlet. After roughing her up in an office, he forced her into the warehouse. He tied her to a forklift and told her she was going to die.
And then hoisted her, literally hoisted the lift up to where she was dangling with her feet about 6 or 8 inches off the ground.
She hung there for almost a minute. Then the rope broke and she fought her way free. The plastic wrap that bound her wrists was taken into evidence. Police learned from the carpet store manager that one employee, Larry Reed, fit the suspect's description. When Reed showed up to work the next day, police were there to meet him. He admitted that he'd picked up a hooker the night before, but when questioned about it, he became evasive and uncooperative. He refused to give any more information without an attorney present. Police heard all they needed. They arrested Reed for the attempted murder of Lisa Benson. A look into his background revealed a disturbing history of assaults on little girls and elderly women. He had been institutionalized more than once, but nothing, it seemed, could tame his instinct to prey on vulnerable females. Reed fit the profile of a sadistic sexual predator, but so far the case against him was based only on the word of a prostitute. To make the conviction stick, detectives needed physical evidence proving that he caused her injuries. They obtained a warrant to search the office where Benson claimed to have been attacked. They found blood spatter throughout the office. The pattern of droplets revealed repeated blows to the body, probably with a blunt instrument. The underside of the carpet disclosed 2 large bloodstains, although the top of the carpet had been cleaned. Criminalists are often called on to build a case from a single drop of blood. In this case, however, they had copious amounts. They found more on the dashboard, glove compartment, and steering column of Reed's car. The evidence was sent to the lab. The results were anything but routine. Tests confirmed that all the samples were blood, but not a drop of it came from Lisa Benson. Investigators in Oregon faced an unnerving predicament. Their routine investigation into Lisa Benson's assault had exposed a much greater crime. Not only was Benson's blood a mismatch, the spatter and saturated carpet didn't correspond to her injuries. Forensics determined that the amount of bloodshed indicated that someone had been brutally murdered in the manager's office. Now they had a homicide investigation with no clues about the victim. They didn't even know when he or she was killed. They did, however, have a suspect, Larry Reed. His manager at the carpet warehouse told investigators that almost 2 months earlier, Reed had said he needed his carpet cleaned. Reed explained the situation to his boss.
Mr. Reed had reported that a customer had come into the business during the evening hours of December 7th, and that this person had complained about being sick and had gone into this office and had thrown up, and in throwing up he had also thrown up some blood.
The story was unlikely, but at least it gave investigators a time frame for the murder. A little research brought to light an unsolved murder in the next county. In December 1994, fishermen noticed something peculiar floating in the Santiam River. Closer inspection revealed it was a body. They marked the location and contacted the sheriff's office. Investigators retrieved the nude body of a woman from the muddy water. Though the water had distorted her features beyond recognition, the numerous wounds to her head were plain to see. Someone had murdered this woman and dumped her body into the river. These murky depths, the killer hoped, would conspire to keep his secrets hidden forever. The medical examiner determined that the victim was around 40 years old. The degree of tissue decay and the amount of mud and algae coating the body told him that she'd been in the water for several weeks. 7 penetrating wounds had fractured her skull, inflicting fatal damage. From the size and magnitude of the wounds, the pathologist believed the murder weapon to be a tool with a hammerhead on one side and a cutting blade on the other. Identifying the victim would be a challenge. Because she had no fillings, there would be no dental records for comparison. And because of her time in the water, technicians were unable to render fingerprints by the standard inking method. But they had other ways. The hands were amputated according to standard scientific practice and sent to the police lab. There, highly detailed photographs of the fingertips were taken. These photographs were compared to a police database of fingerprints from women matching the victim's description. They came up with a match. The fingerprints belonged to Marjorie Lynn Sessions, a 38-year-old prostitute.
Detectives from the Lynn County Sheriff's Office, which is south of us, advised that they were working a homicide case involving a woman named Margie Sessions. The detectives from Lynn County advised that Margie's lifestyle was one of being involved with the methamphetamine use and prostitution.
December 7th, the same day that Reed reported the bloody carpet stain, was the day Marjorie Sessions had last been seen alive. Since both women were prostitutes, it appeared that his attack on Lisa Benson was part of his chilling pattern.
And so it was those two significant facts that led detectives to kind of put the two cases together.
Only a DNA test could definitively link Reed to the murder of Marjorie Sessions. If the victim's DNA matched DNA taken from the blood found at the carpet warehouse, investigators would have their man. It wasn't so easy. The victim had been in the river so long that the water degraded the DNA in her blood. But there was one last chance. In March 1995, 3 months after her death, the victim's body was exhumed. Technicians extracted dental pulp and bone marrow. From these samples, they generated a DNA barcode. In order to confirm that the DNA had not been degraded, technicians compared it against tissue samples from the victim's parents. The genetic pattern was intact. When tested against the blood samples from the suspect's office, it matched the DNA pattern for every stain collected. The blood work proved that Marjorie Sessions had been wounded in Larry Reed's office and that the suspect had transferred some of the blood to the interior of his vehicle. But it couldn't prove for a fact that Larry Reed had killed her. The only way to do that would be to establish a relationship between the suspect and the dumping of the body. Before they could solve this case, investigators had one more river to cross. In order to prove that Larry Reed had murdered Marjorie Sessions, detectives needed to show that the suspect was responsible for disposing of her body in the river. Scouring police records for similar attacks in the area, they made a crucial discovery. Back on December 7th, the day after Sessions was last seen alive, an illegal dumping report was filed in neighboring Polk County. Residents had reported a man fitting Reed's description getting out of a pickup truck to dump trash along a roadside.
Make sure we get that tag.
The bag, which bore traces of blood, contained blood-stained paper towels. Mixed among them was a single sheet of plastic shrink wrap. Nearby, investigators found a carpet remnant, also spotted with blood. They had no way to trace whose blood it was or who had dumped the trash there until now. Samples had been saved and were brought to the forensics lab. Each item was carefully studied. The single piece of plastic wrap was compared with the wrap collected from the Benson case. Criminalist Brad Putnam performed the analysis.
The first thing we did was look at the class characteristics, the physical characteristics of the plastic. Is it clear? Is it colored? Is it opaque? Can you see through it? We took measurements of the thickness, of the width.
Experts couldn't prove that the plastic wrap found at the dump site came from the same roll as the plastic used to gag Lisa Benson. But they were able to prove that it was identical to the wrap found at the factory where Reed worked. It was of the exact same shape, width, and coloring.
Now that was real significant for us because we knew Mr. Reed worked as a carpet salesman. We also knew that at the carpet store, he had used plastic shrink wrap on Miss Benson to put around her mouth and around her throat. And we had the same type of plastic wrap found at the illegal dump site.
The blood found on the carpet and paper towels sealed Reed's fate. It matched the blood found in his office. It had come from Marjorie Sessions. Based solely on forensic evidence, detectives had pieced together the details of her murder, from initial contact to the time her body entered the water.
Forensics supported witness statements from the unlawful dumping. It helped solidify some of the theories that may have been going on and really tied kind of a multi-jurisdictional nightmare into a nice, tidy package for the prosecution.
There you go. My name's Larry. Marjorie.
Janice.
Police believe that on the night of December 7th, Reed picked up Sessions at a bar.
I'll catch you later. Okay. See you later.
As he had done with Benson, he brought her back to his manager's office, where things turned violent. Repeated blows to her head ended her life. Reed then dumped the body in the Santiam River. Even if she were eventually found, he thought, there would be no way to tie her to him. But Reed underestimated the power of forensics to draw a link with Marjorie Sessions, to coax DNA from the grave, and to turn flimsy bits of trash into an incontrovertible murder charge.
Confronted with that much physical evidence, it's pretty hard to deny involvement.
Reed was sentenced to 40 years for the murder of Marjorie Sessions and the attack on Lisa Benson. Thanks to the forensics analysis, a case that seemed destined to go unsolved was proved beyond a shadow of a doubt. And a predator who may have gone on hunting for years was stopped in his tracks. Honing their skills with each attack, sadistic killers are some of the most difficult criminals to catch. Today, science is giving law enforcement the edge. With the use of advanced forensic techniques, investigators can build a solid case from the scattered clues they leave in their wake. As a young woman slowly grows weaker, a murder investigation gains strength. To solve it, detectives must extract a dark family secret from the grave. A tight circle of friends contracts as, one by one, its members die mysteriously. The circumstances are suspicious, but there's little evidence of murder. When a woman is poisoned to death, her survivors point fingers at each other. To find the killer, investigators must get to the source of the bad blood. Even when its symptoms are dramatic, poison is a subtle menace. The poisoner is a two-faced monster whose loved ones become victims of tainted trust. On September 19, 1979, Marie Hilley rushed to the University of Alabama Hospital in Birmingham. Her 19-year-old daughter, Carol, was very sick. For the past 5 months, she'd suffered severe vomiting, stomach cramps, a deteriorating nervous system, and paralysis in her legs. Her hands became clawed and nearly useless. Marie, a widow who doted on her only daughter, was frantic to find a cure for Carol's grave illness.
Gonna be able to hold anything down?
Yeah.
Good.
After months of shuttling Carol from doctor to doctor, seldom leaving her bedside, Marie was at the end of her rope. Doctors told her that Carol might have a virus or some other condition, but she'd yet to get a clear diagnosis about what was crippling her daughter. Carol's illness was taking its toll on Marie as well.
Marie Hilley. I'm Marie Hilley.
On Carol's first day at the University of Alabama Hospital, a plainclothes police officer came looking for Marie.
Yes, what can I do for you?
He asked if he could speak to her in private.
In truth, I don't really want to talk to you about right here.
Be right back, Carol.
Carol's mounting medical bills were wreaking havoc with Marie's finances. A bank and a furniture store in nearby Anniston filed complaints against her for passing bad checks. The officer served Marie with an arrest warrant. He was taking her to jail. Not wanting to alarm her daughter, Marie made up a story about why she had to leave. Carol had no knowledge of her mom's arrest. The next day, when Carol couldn't reach her mother, she called her Aunt Frida, who came to see her and tell her about Marie. Frida had news for the doctors, too, expressing her concern about Marie's care of Carol. She said that Marie moved Carol from hospital to hospital before the young woman could be properly diagnosed. She also claimed to have witnessed Marie giving Carol shots. She feared that Marie's desperate attempts to heal her daughter were only making her more ill. This possibility made Carol's doctor rethink his diagnosis. Perhaps her illness was caused by a toxin rather than a virus. He realized her symptoms were consistent with heavy metal poisoning, most commonly arsenic. Often called the great imitator, arsenic routinely escapes early diagnosis, masquerading as food poisoning or the flu. The misjudgment could be fatal, according to forensic toxicologist Chip Walls, now lab director at the University of Miami School of Medicine.
In many cases, the chronic poisoning with arsenic has been missed at the early stages, and the person either goes on and either gets better or dies from the chronic poisoning.
Hi, Miss Hilley. We're going to take a nail sample.
But once
and a
it's
hair
suspected,
sample, and it won't hurt.
long-term arsenic poisoning is easy to diagnose. Carol's fingernails displayed the broad white lines called Mees lines that signal the presence of arsenic in the bloodstream for longer than 6 weeks. Following up on this crucial discovery, nail and hair samples were sent to the lab to determine the extent of her poisoning. That would help determine the source of her exposure and how long she'd been exposed. The samples are carefully weighed before they're put into what's called a digesting flask. Nitric and sulfuric acid are mixed with the sample and heated. The digested sample is then ready to be analyzed. Early readings showed high levels of the poison in Carol's samples, but it would take weeks to get more detailed results. Because arsenic is found in nature and is a common ingredient in pesticides, her exposure could have been accidental. But not everyone believed that.
How are you?
While the samples were being tested, Anniston police received a letter from Carol's brother.
Forensic report. I thought you might want to see what that thing looks like.
From Hilly's son?
He believed that Marie Hilly may have killed her husband 4 years earlier and was now poisoning her daughter. Lieutenant Gary Carroll, now chief investigator, went to speak with Carol Hilly.
During the interview, Carol had outlined a number of events that had occurred to her beginning sometime, I think, in mid-April of 1979.
Carol explained that within a month she'd endured 2 hospital stays. She enjoyed a brief recovery until August, when her illness took a turn for the worse.
Your doctor gives you?
She told detectives that the change occurred just after she moved from her mother's house to her own apartment.
Pete, I brought you something to drink.
Though Carol looked forward to living alone, Marie practically moved in with her from the very first day, keeping house and doing most of the cooking.
So much. Carol, honey, we're ready to go.
Within days, she fell seriously ill, suffering from nausea and severe cramps. Marie rushed her to a hospital where she stayed for a week. But when doctors offered no quick solution, Marie abruptly moved Carol to another hospital. Carol recalled that in September, while she was in the hospital, her mother gave her 2 orange pills and 2 injections. Marie told her daughter they would ease the paralysis in her legs, but still her illness progressed.
Here it goes.
Marie Hilly's behavior prompted Lieutenant Carroll to request the police file on her. He knew that she had been a victim of a series of strange events ever since her husband died. Carroll hoped the files might reveal some pattern.
Back in 1977, our police department had received numerous complaints from Marie Hilly regarding vandalisms, harassing phone calls, burglaries, fires, and etc. Many things going on at her residence.
Marie collected substantial insurance claims for damage to her house, her daughter's car, and her husband Frank's death. Seeing a possible motive, Lieutenant Carroll looked into the status of Carol Hilly's life insurance.
Written with the offhand. Call the coroner about this.
Marie was the beneficiary, but the policy had lapsed.
Okay. I'll meet with you tomorrow.
According to the insurance company, Marie had made several desperate attempts to have it reinstated, but every one of her checks bounced.
Yeah.
Following up on the letter sent by Carol Hilly's brother, Lieutenant Carroll received a copy of Frank Hilly's medical records. Frank and Marie Hilly appeared to be an average happy couple. They were married for 25 years and raised 2 children, Mike and Carol. As her kids were growing up, Marie maintained an active social life. Frank enjoyed his role of the hard-working breadwinner, active, healthy, and rarely missing a day of work. But one evening in May 1975, Frank came home in agony from an upset stomach. He stayed home most of the next week. Marie tended to him around the clock. But Frank's condition worsened rapidly. Within a matter of days, he was dead.
No, don't lift your head.
At the time, the circumstances were considered tragic, but not criminal. And even now, it seemed inconceivable that a woman could be cold-blooded enough to poison her own family. Marie Hilly just didn't fit the mold of murderer. But in hindsight, Frank Hilly's symptoms suggested a classic case of arsenic poisoning. To be sure, investigators needed to exhume his body. It would be easier with Marie's permission.
I read them to you?
Yes.
With these rights in mind, would you...
She was still in custody for writing bad checks. She denied any involvement in her husband's death.
Just sign this, please, right here.
And granted permission for his exhumation and autopsy.
The person at the hospital?
When asked about Carol, she denied poisoning her or even giving her medication. But investigators persisted.
Finally, upon being confronted about having given Carol shots, she finally admitted that she did give Carol some shots. She says she got, it was some medication she got from a nurse who worked at one of the hospitals. Case in, please.
But police were unable to locate a nurse matching the name or description Marie gave. 1 week later, authorities exhumed Frank Hilly's body. It said that dead men tell no tales, but only Frank could tell them if his devoted wife and the mother of his children was a murderer. While investigators in Alabama collected hair and nail samples from Frank Hilly's exhumed remains, the results from Carol Hilly's arsenic testing came back from the lab. The analysis showed abnormal levels of arsenic along the length of her hair, demonstrating long-term exposure to the poison. The hair closest to Carol's scalp had 35 times the amount of arsenic than on the outer part, revealing that she'd received recent high doses. Her mother, Marie Hilly, was still the prime suspect in the slow and painful poisoning of her daughter. All that remained was the proof. It wasn't long in coming. On the morning of October 8th, police received a note from Carol's Aunt Frida, along with a prescription bottle containing a clear liquid. The note said she found the bottle in Marie's jewelry box. Detective Carroll sent the bottle for analysis. A half hour later, the lab confirmed the bottle contained arsenic. A similar vial was taken from Marie's purse when she was first arrested for check bouncing. It appeared empty, but investigators suspected it might hold some residue. They rinsed it with distilled water, then tested the rinse water. Once again, they found arsenic.
Mrs. Hilly, you're under arrest for the attempted murder of your daughter.
On October 9, 1979, Marie Hilly was served with warrants charging her with attempting to poison Carol.
Not make any statement at all. Any statement you make may
Additional warrants were served for passing more bad checks, but these charges paled in comparison to what police still suspected, that Marie Hilly had murdered her husband. Still, they had no proof.
Hire a lawyer. You have the right to have a lawyer appointed.
We had not received any information from the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences on the autopsy results from Frank, so we were awaiting those, And during the meantime, she made bond and got out on the attempt to poison charge and also the 2 check charges.
But Marie could not feel too relieved. The same tests that found arsenic in her daughter's system were being used on samples taken from her late husband, and with much the same result. Frank Hilly had been poisoned. The evidence showed that the poison was taken a little at a time, with a large dose at the end. On January 11, 1980, the Calhoun County Grand Jury indicted Marie Hilly for first-degree murder. Hilly received life plus 20 years for attempting to poison her daughter. But Marie Hilly wound up serving only a fraction of that time. After 3 years, she'd manipulated the warden into trusting her with a 3-day furlough. When it was time for her to return, it was clear that Marie Hilly had escaped. But her getaway didn't last. A week later, she was discovered, apparently trying to break into a house. Her clothes were soaked and she acted delirious. She suffered a massive heart attack and died that evening. Marie Hilly was buried next to her husband Frank, the man she'd poisoned to death. Why would a seemingly devoted wife and mother poison members of her family? Perhaps money was the original motive. But since her daughter Carol's life insurance policy had lapsed, there was no financial reward in killing her. Maybe, in Marie Hilly's mind, murder became its own reward. In that regard, she wasn't alone. On the afternoon of June 28, 1987, Carrie Middleton answered a call to check on 30-year-old Lisa K. Chandler in Odessa, Texas. Lisa had been seriously depressed, and her friends were concerned. Carrie found Lisa in her bedroom, dead. She ran to phone the police, not to call in a suicide, but to report a murder. Police found no evidence of a crime, no forced entry or signs of struggle. In fact, there seemed no cause of death at all.
I need to bag this note. Don, give me a bag to put
On the
this note in.
nightstand lay a scrap of paper with scribbled notes, but it didn't mention suicide or anything else that could be related to Lisa's death.
I'm gonna take this out. Be right back.
A washcloth on the floor had no stains or other visible clues. It seemed the victim had died peacefully and mysteriously in her sleep.
Morning, Gene. How are you this morning?
According to Detective Mickey Brown, now a chief of police, that was reason enough to investigate further.
Thank you. You have a victim here that apparently there's no reason for cause of death, and this is a young female. There's no trauma, so I immediately become suspicious as to what caused this young lady's death.
Out of her mind with grief, Carrie Middleton insisted to police that her friend was murdered. But without any evidence, their best strategy was to wait for the autopsy report.
He told me to check all the funny stuff. I know. Look.
Tissue samples were sent to the Texas College of Osteopathic Medicine, where forensic toxicologist Gary Wimbish tested them.
We look for the drugs or substances with the highest probability of having an association with the cause of death. For example, ethyl alcohol, carbon monoxide, other volatile substances or alcohols that may have been involved. Drugs of abuse would be high priority, and then second with routine prescription medication.
Blood specimens revealed a high concentration of ethyl alcohol found in wine or beer. Though it may have contributed, the alcohol couldn't have caused Lisa's death on its own. With the victim's death still a mystery, Detective Brown couldn't discount the possibility of foul play. He'd learned from Carrie Middleton that Lisa was in the middle of a bitter divorce from her husband, Kyle. Carrie also said Lisa was having an affair with David Dowler, a mutual friend with an exotic lifestyle.
Well, the more she talked, she got into telling us about Dowler, and it began to read like a Tom Clancy novel. You know, he was claiming to work for the government, to be work for the CIA, to be a spy catcher, things of that nature. And she was very sincere in what she was telling us, but it seemed far out at the time.
Because Dowler was the last person to be seen with the victim, an interview was arranged. He was cooperative and seemed friendly and personable. Dowler claimed Carrie was mistaken about his work for the CIA. But he did share the opinion that Lisa Chandler was a victim of foul play. He also had an idea who her killer was, Kyle Chandler, Lisa's husband. He said Kyle was furious that she was cheating on him.
Good morning.
Kyle Chandler was next on the list to be interviewed. Fearing he was the prime suspect in his wife's death, Chandler brought his lawyer with him. Kyle also felt that Lisa was murdered, but he pointed the finger back at his accuser, David Dowler.
The names of your closest friends that you and Lisa had? I'm Juan. How are you?
Hi, Juan.
Kyle Chandler portrayed Dowler as an unusual man with a sinister edge. He owned and operated a one-hour photo shop, but claimed that was only a cover for his real job as a CIA agent. As a government insider, Dowler claimed he knew in advance which friends were in danger. He seemed to be right. According to Kyle Chandler, Dowler knew more than he was letting on about the death of Lisa Chandler and the unexplained deaths of two of their other friends. The investigation into Lisa Chandler's death was taking an unexpected turn. When Detective Mickey Brown looked back over the files, he discovered that Lisa Chandler was the third of her circle of friends to die mysteriously. And in each case, David Dowler was mentioned as one of the last people to see the victim alive. 4 years before the death of Lisa Chandler, another of Dowler's girlfriends met a similar fate. Lisa Craig was found lying as if she'd died in her sleep. There were no signs of forced entry into her home, nor any signs of trauma on her body. The only suspicious things were notes scribbled in the margins of her Bible. Craig believed someone wanted to kill her. Craig had a history of anorexia nervosa. An autopsy found no other evidence, so the medical examiner concluded she died as a result of that condition. However, since there was no specific cause of death, he left her file open and saved her tissue samples.
Hi, ma'am. How are you today?
3 years later, the next to die was Dowler's business partner, Juan Casillas. After Dowler was laid off from his job at an oil company, he and Casillas opened a photo store together. In 1986, Kyle Chandler found Casillas at his home, dead on the kitchen floor. The autopsy revealed an unidentified substance in his tissues. Samples were saved according to hospital policy, but no cause of death was determined. Detective Brown now wondered if Kyle Chandler did more than just discover Juan Casillas' death. He began to think that maybe he caused it. Brown learned that Juan Casillas was married to Lisa Chandler before Kyle married her. First, Casillas died, and now Lisa was dead too. That gave Kyle Chandler a direct connection to 2 of the 3 mysterious deaths in his tight circle of friends. But Kyle Chandler wasn't the only suspect. In each of the 3 deaths, David Dowler made the phone call that led to the body being discovered. Detective Brown had 3 deaths and 2 likely suspects. He needed help sorting them out. He remembered an offer made to him by Carrie Middleton concerning David Dowler. She was convinced Dowler was the killer, living out some deranged fantasy. She wanted the chance to prove it.
During the interview with Carrie, I expressed some reservations to her about the story that she was telling me, and she voluntarily said that she would be more than happy to wear a microphone or a wire where I could firsthand listen to David Dowler telling her these stories.
David Dowler may have pretended to be a government agent, but Carrie Middleton was about to do some real undercover work.
Not everybody.
Okay. Just relax.
True to her word, she agreed to wear a wire so that police could hear her conversations with David Dowler.
Sure, relax. Okay, let's make sure it doesn't show up.
Detective Mickey Brown also had surveillance cameras set up in Carrie's apartment so police could watch them.
Hear me through this?
Yes, make sure.
We'll test it before you go in.
Put a couple buttons in so it doesn't.
Brown knew that time spent here would either help the investigation or take him down the entirely wrong road.
We had a total of 16 hours of recordings on him on about 3 occasions. He totally dominated the conversations. He talked constantly.
Most of the talk was idle banter. But in one of these conversations, he described how to murder someone by putting chloroform in their car ventilation. Then he outlined a likely method the killer would have used to kill Lisa Chandler with chloroform. Dowler offered detailed descriptions of how Lisa Craig and Juan Casillas were probably murdered using cyanide. And he told Carrie he was afraid she might be next. These were either the veiled confessions of a mad serial killer, the ramblings of a man desperate for attention, or both. His own words made Dowler the prime suspect. But the proof of those words had to be verified in the lab. Tissue samples from Lisa Craig and Juan Casillas were sent to Gary Wimbish to test for cyanide.
The test that we employed to assay for the cyanide actually is a testing protocol that is not ancient, but certainly has been around for a while, called a Conway diffusion cell.
It's a simple device that holds a blood sample in one compartment, a trapping solution in the center, and sulfuric acid on the other side. The container is then sealed and rotated so that the blood and acid mix. The acid releases the cyanide from the blood in its gaseous form, which is then trapped by the solution in the center compartment. The solution changes color to indicate how much cyanide is present.
We found rather large amounts of cyanide present in the blood specimens of Casillas and Craig. The concentrations were about 7 to 10 times the amount that are often found in lethal cases.
The results were indisputable. Both Craig and Casillas were killed with cyanide. To test Lisa Chandler, Wimbish used a gas chromatograph to detect traces of chloroform. A microscopic tissue sample was placed into the apparatus, which was calibrated to show the unique spectroscopic fingerprint of chlorine compounds.
This is the internal standard, and this is where
The
ethanol
test
comes
revealed
out.
that Lisa
And this
Chandler
is
had
the,
enough chloroform in her system to
delineation
kill
of the order
7
of
people.
sequence. All right, good.
Unmasked by his own incessant conversation, the real David Dowler was finally revealed.
And then once we verified through the post-mortem and the toxicology results that this was in fact how the victims had died, we knew then that we had our predator. We knew who we had then.
David Dowler wasn't a concerned friend or a government agent, but a very sick and dangerous serial killer. Armed with the toxicology reports and information gathered from surveillance, Detective Brown secured a warrant for Dowler's residence. But he wasn't through yet. He wanted to be sure he had enough to win this case. He hoped for a confession, if not to police, then to Carrie Middleton.
We decided to tape one more conversation to try to obtain as much evidence as possible.
By going through with another meeting, Brown was using his key witness as live bait for a known killer. Carrie was putting her life on the line. By now, Dowler might have suspected she was talking to police. Even with officers just outside, she'd be on her own if Dowler moved in quickly with a knife or gun. As an extra precaution, Detective Brown wired Carrie's entire home and had additional police standing by just in case. That evening, when Dowler came to Carrie's home, the two spoke amiably at first, concentrating on small talk. Then, Dowler began talking about how the police were bungling the investigation into Lisa Chandler's death. He mentioned that he kept a pistol in his car and once again told Carrie that she was in danger. Then, he suddenly announced he had to leave for a moment, but that he'd be right back. That was enough for Detective Brown.
He's heading south.
Not wanting to
First
risk
Street.
Carrie's life any further, he had his officers move in and arrest Dowler in his car.
Down. Put your hands up. On your knees. On your knees.
From the evidence retrieved at the scene, Detective Brown may have acted just in time.
We arrested Dowler shortly after he left the witness's residence, and we found in his possession a pistol, a silencer, ammunition. We also found some lockpick sets and ski mask that he had.
These suspicious articles couldn't begin to suggest the vast and deadly arsenal Dowler had at his disposal. At his house, detectives uncovered explosives, blasting caps, crude eavesdropping equipment, more homemade gun silencers, and chemicals used to make explosives and poison. The police needed a truck to haul it all away. Dowler's lab was the incubator for 3 murders. Mixing chemicals into a lethal brew, he was able to concoct his deadly schemes. He denied killing Lisa Chandler and told investigators he was only trying to help her.
I want you to be honest about what's really bothering me.
First, he said he had her write down questions about their relationship. Then he said he would help her find a hypnotic state by pouring chloroform into a washcloth that was covering her face. According to Dowler, she would then be able to answer her own questions with her subconscious.
Get comfortable.
He said that she was getting tired, so he left.
Yeah.
Dowler claimed she must have taken more chloroform herself to commit suicide. Investigators didn't believe it, no bottle of chloroform was found at the scene. The forensics report also proved Dowler's story couldn't be true.
That couldn't have happened because when Dr. Wimbish did the toxicology, she had 7 times the toxic amount in her system, and she would have been sound asleep long before she could have self-administered that much chloroform to her.
Dowler had administered the fatal dose. He may have lived a fantasy life as a secret agent, but he played the real-life role of murderer. In January 1988, David Dowler was sentenced to life in prison for the death of Lisa Chandler. Because he received the highest possible penalty, he was not tried for the other 2 murders he is suspected of. David Dowler killed for the sake of killing. In Little Rock, Arkansas, investigators found that poison was just one part of a killer's elaborate master plan. Georgia Weaver had recently come to live with her sister, Jeannie Allen. When Jeannie had told her younger sister that her cozy home had become too much for her to manage by herself, Georgia was happy to move in and help out. On December 19, 1992, Jeannie was struck with a sudden, intense illness. Georgia, who also felt ill, rushed her sister to the hospital. For 2 weeks, doctors puzzled over the root of her symptoms, thinking it might be food poisoning. When her condition worsened, they ordered tests for heavy metal poisoning. The results showed Jeannie had nearly 20 times the normal amount of arsenic in her system. Intentionally or by accident, Jeannie Allen was being poisoned. Jeannie's son, Jerry Allen, reacted to the news by going to the police. He was certain his mother's poisoning was no accident. He told them that the situation wasn't always so rosy between his mother and his aunt, Georgia Weaver. Detective Steve Moore listened to Jerry Allen's story.
He told us that they had been involved in a dispute in years past over an inheritance from their mother who had died, and apparently Miss Weaver had spent some of the money without Miss Allen's knowledge.
The sisters hadn't spoken to each other for 4 years. Jeannie had only recently decided to make amends and invite Georgia back into her life. Jeannie was lonely. Her husband, James Allen, was incapacitated with a stroke, and her kids were grown. Georgia began spending the night at Jeannie's house and cooking all of the meals. But Jerry believed that Georgia was scheming to take financial advantage of his mother once again.
Need more pop?
No.
3 months before Jeannie fell ill, Jerry confronted Georgia at his mother's house, triggering a tremendous argument. Georgia called the police to have Jerry removed from the premises. Bad blood clearly flowed within the family, but there was little to link it with Jeannie's current condition.
When Jerry Allen first came to us, we were concerned about, were we getting in the middle of a family squabble? Was there really a crime here? Was there really something we needed to be involved in?
But 2 days after Jerry filed his report, Jeannie Allen died from arsenic poisoning. Now the police had to get involved. Though it was still uncertain if Jeannie's poisoning was intentional, the death needed to be investigated. Police began by interviewing Jeannie's friends and family members.
Thank you.
Certainly. Something to eat?
No, thank you.
One of the first was Georgia Weaver.
All right, what can I help you with?
Cordial and friendly, her anger rose when she talked about her nephew, Jerry Allen.
Oh, I don't have arsenic in the house. You can't...
Georgia told police that Jerry resented her because Jeannie trusted her more. She claimed that if anyone poisoned Jeannie, it would be Jerry, who was jockeying to gain control of Jeannie Allen's money. Investigators now had 2 suspects, and yet they weren't even certain a crime had been committed. Before they could determine that, they had to determine how long Jeannie Allen had been exposed to the arsenic and how she had consumed it. To find out if Jeannie Allen had been intentionally poisoned, investigators examined her hair. The arsenic leaves a record along the growing strands. The hair samples are cut into segments, then wrapped securely in a paper form that establishes the chain of evidence. Because plastic bags could contaminate biological samples, labs use paper wrapping. Each segment is individually tested for arsenic. The duration of a person's exposure can be determined by seeing how much of the hair contains the poison. According to criminalist Gary Lawrence, it is not uncommon to find arsenic in any hair sample.
Most people have a normal background level of arsenic within the body, and if they receive from some form an amount of arsenic that's abnormal to the body, I think the system has a way of working some of that out.
If the arsenic were in the environment, investigators would expect to find minute traces along the length of the hair. If the poison were administered intentionally, it would usually appear as one big dose on the portion of hair closest to the scalp.
I don't believe it's very easy to hide arsenic poisoning. It can be done, but again, even when you get up to the long-term dosages, even at low levels, the buildup of the arsenic within the body is eventually going to show up.
The report showed normal trace levels of arsenic along most of the length of the hair. But on the segment closest to the scalp, the hair contained 13 times the normal amount of the poison. The results suggested that Jeannie Allen's death was no accident.
Now let's get everything out of this closet.
To find the source of the arsenic, police conducted a search of her house and confiscated all of the food and medicine they could find. About 100 items in all. At the Arkansas State Crime Lab, each sample was bombarded with X-rays in a technique called X-ray fluorescence. Electrons in the samples become excited, giving off specific levels of energy. The lab looked for energy levels characteristic of arsenic. The lab tests for the samples taken from Jeannie Allen's home would take several months to complete.
What's the problem?
There's some very strange things going on in this house.
In the meantime, police conducted interviews with her
All of a
neighbors.
sudden, Georgia won't let me see her. I went
It
where
wasn't
Georgia
long
was.
before they narrowed their list of
It's just
suspects
very
from
strange.
2
I understand
to
that there's
1.
missing that she's supposed to have.
Many neighbors said that mysterious changes occurred once Georgia Weaver moved in. Jeannie Allen came outside less and less. Georgia collected the mail and ran errands. Jeannie soon stopped calling her friends. And when they tried to get in touch with her, Georgia was always there, blocking the way.
If somebody went over there or called over there, Georgia answered the phone. Georgia came to the door, and they never saw Jeannie again. It was like she didn't exist, basically. Georgia checked the mail. Georgia basically took over the household, which made me suspicious that a grown lady that was not in any medical condition at that time, no senility or anything, would just let somebody take over their home like that.
As suspicions began focusing on Georgia Weaver, investigators uncovered more to incriminate her. On December 22nd, just days after Jeannie Allen was admitted to the hospital, Georgia went to the bank and, using the power of attorney, closed Jeannie Allen's account. She took $1,300 and the contents of her safe deposit box. Georgia was arrested at her job in a local motel.
You're under arrest.
In her possession was about $1,000, Jeannie Allen's car, a credit card, and her power of attorney. Upon closer inspection, investigators noticed an odd detail about the power of attorney.
Yeah, see if you know these guys in there.
On this document, legally handing Jeannie's rights to Georgia Weaver, both Jeannie Allen's printed name and signature were misspelled. In order to get a true sample of Georgia's signature, police had her sign her name and Jeannie's several times in front of witnesses.
Oh no, we're not finished yet.
The signatures were sent to the Arkansas State Crime Lab for analysis. Jeannie Allen's known signature was compared with Georgia's version of the signature. The differences went beyond the spelling errors, according to Dawn Reed, Chief of Question Documents.
There were pressure habits that were extremely different. Extreme differences were noted between the spacing habits of the writer on the question document and the known handwriting of Jeannie Allen. The uppercase J was a two-stroke J that Jeannie Allen usually wrote, and on the question document it was very flourished.
But when Reed compared the signatures written by Georgia Weaver to the one on the power of attorney, she knew she caught the forger hands down.
I positively identified Georgia Weaver as writing Jeannie Allen's signature on the power of attorney, which is totally conclusive. There was no qualified opinion. She wrote that. The probability that any other individual could have is nil.
Georgia was arrested for theft and forgery. She may have been a killer, too, if investigators could only prove it. Georgia Weaver posted bond for her arrests on theft and forgery, but her troubles weren't over. A few weeks later, she was charged with stealing employee checks from the motel where she worked and forging the signatures on them. She was arrested again. Though she was proving to be a thief and a forger, investigators had nothing to tie her to the murder of her sister, Jeannie Allen. Then, a co-worker reported finding a bottle of rat poison hidden where Georgia always kept her purse. It wasn't a brand the motel used. It was sent to the police and passed on to the Arkansas State Crime Lab for analysis. The active ingredient was arsenic. This evidence, tangible but circumstantial, was the first to link Georgia to the poison. Now, investigators needed to link the source of the poison to her sister. In August 1993, the extensive tests on items from Jeannie Allen's home were complete. Arsenic was discovered in 2 containers of punch and a bottle of cold medicine. The link was established. Detective Moore only hoped it was strong enough.
At that point, I felt we had what we needed to bring her to justice. We knew that it would be a battle as far as getting her convicted, but we didn't feel that we had any other choice but to try to get her put in prison where we felt she belonged.
From the evidence, investigators surmised that after ingratiating herself with her sister, Georgia began spiking her medicine and beverages with the rat poison she kept hidden at her workplace, finally killing her with one big dose. On May 4th, 1994, Georgia Weaver was convicted of the capital murder of her sister, Jeannie Allen.
I believe what motivated Georgia was greed, power, and also probably a motivational fact was that she wanted what Jeannie had as far as a home, a family, the financial stability that she had, whereas Georgia was alone, out of money. And I believe that maybe that she saw that's the only way she could get what that had was to take this route.
But the route she took proved to be a dead end. Georgia Weaver was sentenced to life in prison with no parole and is currently serving at the Arkansas Department of Corrections. The act of poisoning begins with a simple premise. The poisoner believes he can hide his guilt behind a mask of concern. But time and again, forensics has proven this premise false.
Becky!
Investigators find a clue they think will lead to a killer's front door, but instead find themselves heading down a blind alley. Now their most important evidence is withering before their eyes. When a man reports his wife missing, her abandoned car becomes the biggest clue. But it's the nosy neighbors who drive the investigation. 4 months into her marriage, a woman disappears. But when her body turns up, it's clear she was no runaway bride. Investigators must rely on flimsy evidence to bag her killer. For some lovers, marriage can be murder. Even though proving it may pose a challenge, killers can't divorce themselves from the consequences of their broken vows. In the early morning hours of December 28, 1995, Melinda and David McLean let themselves into the apartment of their sister-in-law, Becky Vargas. The telephone and electricity in her unit hadn't been switched on yet. Becky was separating from her husband and had just rented the Ogden, Utah apartment.
Becky!
She had told her husband, Stephen Vargas, that she was going to try to start organizing her belongings and would return in an hour or two. But that was several hours ago. Stephen had asked Melinda and David to check on her, since they lived nearby. Melinda, who was Stephen's sister and Becky's best friend, was glad to go. Though they didn't see Becky, all seemed quiet and safe, leaving them unprepared for what they found. Becky Vargas lay dead in the leaves outside the building. Even before the sun was up, the Weber County, Utah Crime Scene Investigation Unit began its day processing the murder scene. The victim's blouse had been pulled up. At first glance, the condition of her clothes made her appear to be the victim of a random sexual homicide. But a closer look revealed the story was not so simple. Criminalist Russ Dean thought the scene might have been staged.
It was as if her body had been moved from one location to another. Her arm was under her body as if she'd been dragged. Her coat was removed and was under her body. The leaves were bunched up in certain locations around her arms and legs. And there was no other obvious indication of any type of sexual assault.
In fact, though the victim had suffered a head injury, most of the blood had pooled at her feet, suggesting she'd been turned around. Whoever did this had apparently tried to throw off the investigators. The forensics team documented and collected a set of car keys, a cigarette lighter, fragments of blood-spattered leaves, and most significantly, the apparent murder weapon, a broken flashlight stained with blood and entangled with hair. They spent 6 hours sifting through every inch of the area before they were satisfied. They determined that although the body had been repositioned, the victim hadn't been moved far. The only blood found was just a few inches from where she lay. Because the blood-stained flashlight was the most compelling clue, it was analyzed first at the Utah State Crime Lab in Salt Lake City. Investigators could see that it had a partial fingerprint on it, stamped in blood. According to latent print examiner Scott Spute, a bloody fingerprint can be even better than a smoking gun.
When we have a bloody fingerprint, for example, it's the victim's blood, it's not her finger, it's someone else's finger on the evidence. It's a crucial pinpointing item of evidence in which we can identify someone being at that crime scene, leaving that bloody fingerprint behind at the scene as they left.
It would be bad practice to home in on that one print. The lab had to inspect the flashlight for additional prints. The obvious ones and the ones that remained invisible. It required two separate processes. Bloodstains, because they're not oily, can flake or rub off. To fix them in place, the flashlight was heated to 100 degrees Celsius for 10 minutes.
After I heat it on, I then put a stain on there which is called amido black, which reacts to the blood and makes it very visible, and oftentimes brings out areas of blood that were invisible prior to treatment.
To develop the latent or unseen prints, the flashlight was exposed to superglue vapor. The adhesive bonds to the moisture on the print, creating a durable shell that exposes and preserves it. Then, a fluorescent dye is applied, which adheres to the superglue. The latent prints shine under ultraviolet light. Testing revealed no other blood-stained prints. The original one, along with the latent prints, would have to do. Once a suspect was isolated, investigators were confident that the bloody fingerprint was all they'd need. While the clues were being scrutinized, Melinda McLean and her husband David went to the police station to give their statements. Melinda told police that she'd been best friends with Becky Vargas for 14 years.
Alone, and then we went back.
Becky had been married to her brother, Stephen Vargas, for 9 of them, but it looked like their marriage was coming to an end.
Do you have any idea how things aren't going well?
As far as she
I have
knew,
2 kids.
the split was amicable.
But, you know, he's trying to work things out. Okay, no, I have a joke for you, okay? There's a screw up.
Though Becky was having an affair that her husband, Stephen Vargas, may have suspected, there didn't seem to be a lot of tension between the couple. In fact, it was Stephen who had called the McLeans to look in on her after the police told him they had no officers available to check on his wife. David McLean, down the hall, told police a similar story. He said that Stephen Vargas had called him just before 11 p.m. the night before the murder.
Did Steve at all go over there?
Stephen was worried because she was away so long, and the apartment had no lights. He said that he and Melinda stopped by. Though Becky's car was in the driveway, there was no answer. They went to a window to see if everything was okay, but stopped when they heard moaning.
Yeah, she sounds busy.
They thought that perhaps her boyfriend was there, so they left. They went to a payphone to tell Stephen that everything was fine. They told him what they had heard, then they left.
Your wife said that you've been seeing a guy.
David told police that out of curiosity, they drove back to Becky's a short time later. Now they were surprised to see Stephen Vargas's Jeep parked out front. Soon he appeared from beside the building, got into the vehicle, and drove off. David said that they caught up with him. Stephen was wearing his bathrobe and slippers. He told them he wanted to check on Becky himself, but asked the McLeans not to tell anyone he was there. When David revealed this detail to the police, Melinda reluctantly admitted it was true. David told police that Stephen called them once more early the following morning. He said that Becky still wasn't home and asked them to check on her again. That's when they found her dead. At autopsy, the medical examiner determined that the lantern found at the scene wasn't the actual murder weapon, but it may have been used to subdue the victim. From the shape of the wound, she was apparently struck down with a hammer or something similar. No such object was located. The killer was clever enough to carry off or remove some of the most incriminating evidence. Authorities hoped he'd left enough behind. At the police station, investigators continued to talk with the McLeans. Their detailed story seemed to pivot on Stephen Vargas. Then it took a more provocative twist when the police dispatcher told Detective David Wheeloth that Vargas was on the phone, but he wasn't calling about his wife.
She said that he was on the phone inquiring about his sister and his brother-in-law, and if they were in fact at the police station. And I told the dispatcher, yeah, that's who we're in here talking to, and if she would ask him if he would mind coming down to the police station as well.
Police told him about Becky's murder and said that his in-laws were fine, but he might not be, because Melinda and David saw him at the murder scene. He admitted that he was there that night, just as the McLeans had said. He peeked in the window, but he heard and saw nothing. Because the window was right next to where the victim was found, Wheeloth didn't believe him.
If Steve had gone there to look and listen, I don't think it would have been likely that he would have not seen Becky lying just a few feet away.
His suspicious behavior and the eyewitness testimony by the McLeans was enough to get a warrant to search Stephen Vargas's Jeep and to collect his fingerprints and a blood sample.
Can you get a paper bag?
Investigators were after anything that could link him to the crime scene. They found nothing but minuscule fragments of leaves, and not even many of those.
Actually, I wish I could find my little
The Jeep looked recently vacuumed. They collected what they could, then returned the vehicle to Vargas and sent him home. The forensics team hoped they wouldn't need to rely on the leaves. Now that they had Vargas's fingerprint, they could compare it to the ones from the flashlight. Most of the prints did, in fact, match Stephen Vargas. But that made sense. He owned it. So the only one that really mattered was the one stamped in blood. The bloody fingerprint had a shape called a tented arch. Of the three features of fingerprints, loops, arches, and whorls, arches are the least common, and tented arches are rarer still. Only 5% of the population has them. Stephen Vargas was among that group. But the fingerprint on the flashlight wasn't clear enough to make a definitive comparison. Vargas might have left it, and then again, maybe not.
I cannot say he did not leave that print behind. I can only say it's not enough to identify it positively.
They thought the flashlight would illuminate the killer. Without it, their hopes of solving the case looked considerably more dim. Investigators working to solve the Becky Vargas homicide saw their most promising piece of evidence rendered useless. According to Detective Wheeloth, a case that had looked cut and dried now depended on very fragile clues.
After we lost the flashlight, about the last piece of physical evidence we had that we could try and do anything with were the leaf fragments that were recovered out of the Jeep.
If investigators could find specks of blood on the tiny fragments, they would support the idea that Stephen Vargas was close enough to the body to have tracked them into his Jeep. It fell to supervising criminalist Pilar Shortsleeve to analyze the minuscule samples.
Trying to see blood on a small piece of colorful leaf was difficult. So we used a stereo zoom so we could get down and look very closely at the leaves, and then to kind of guesstimate if we had any stains, and then we would do some preliminary tests. Well,
out of the 5 samples of leaves, Pilar Shortsleeve found traces of blood on 2, but she had no proof the blood was the victim's. She rushed the samples to a DNA lab for analysis, fearing it might already be too late.
Whenever blood or body fluids are left on soil or samples that contain a lot of possible bacteria, the bacteria begin immediately in destroying the sample. They destroy not only the cells, but they get into the DNA and start to break the DNA down.
It would take 3 months for the results to come back from the lab. Investigators had to bide their time, but they didn't do it idly. They had to assume that the results would be negative and began to build their case some other way. Police served a warrant to search Vargas's apartment. They were after the bathrobe and slippers he was seen wearing at the crime scene. If he had beaten his wife to death, surely they'd be blood spattered. Vargas left the clothes in plain sight, easy to find.
What are you looking for, Detective? I heard that he was supposed to be wearing a bathrobe and a pair of slippers.
The bathrobe had been freshly laundered. The slippers had no trace of debris on them. That in itself was strange, considering he admitted walking outdoors in them.
It seemed like Stephen Vargas was one step ahead of us on getting rid of any physical evidence that might link him to the crime scene. It seemed like every step that we thought of to locate that evidence was foiled.
Robert?
Yeah. But there was one clue he couldn't bury, because it was 375 miles away in Cheyenne, Wyoming. After several weeks of wrestling with his conscience, Vargas's half-brother, Robert Esquivel, called police to tell of a favor that Stephen had asked before Becky's murder.
Steve had asked him if he wowould come out here and kill Becky for him.
Police set up a phone tap in Esquivel's apartment and had him call Vargas to get him to talk about their previous conversation.
Steve had gone through this denying or not remembering that part of their conversation, that it had been a joke, and towards the end even got threatening.
Though it stopped short of a confession, Vargas had said enough for police to arrest him on January 11, 1996 for the murder of Becky Vargas. But they weren't sure they had enough evidence to convict him. 1 month later, the results of the DNA test on the blood-spattered leaves found in Stephen Vargas's Jeep came through. A comparison of the DNA from the blood on the leaves matched Becky Vargas's DNA.
The blood on the blood fragments matched Rebecca Vargas.
Now authorities were confident of a conviction.
Where are you going?
Based on the evidence, police put together a likely scenario. Stephen Vargas, angry with his wife for her infidelity and their upcoming divorce, confronted her at her new apartment. They fought.
Don't you dare accuse me of being a bad woman, don't you?
It escalated.
You're not a good mother because you know that I am.
And he hit her with the flashlight, knocking her out. He moved her to the side of the house, thinking she was dead. He was wrong. He wanted someone else to find the body, so he asked the McLeans to check up on her.
Can we go home
They mistook her death throes for the throes of passion. When they told Stephen, he returned to finish what he'd begun, using a more lethal weapon. Tiny fragments of leaves told the whole story.
Well, in this case in particular, we had this flashlight that had a possible fingerprint in it, in blood, and that would have been the piece of evidence that kind of closed all the loose ends, but it didn't happen. In this case, it was a very small piece of leaf that was found in a vehicle that had blood on it that came from the victim, and it was just the interesting and exciting part that something so small could be so integral in a case.
Stephen Vargas was convicted of first-degree murder and is now serving 20 years to life. The case of Becky Vargas began with the discovery of her body. But when a person just disappears, it's not clear that a crime has even been committed. In this story, the names of the victim and the killer have been changed. On the morning of July 31st, 1987, Dan Remington of San Diego, California, was taking his kids to the YMCA. En route, he noticed his wife's abandoned car on the side of the road. Not wanting to alarm his children, he dropped them off at daycare, then rushed home to call the police. San Diego police dispatched an officer. On his way to Remington's house, he stopped to examine the vehicle. The car apparently had a flat tire. The doors were locked, and he could see no spare, nor any sign of 29-year-old Liz Remington. When the officer arrived at the Remingtons' home, Dan Remington told him that he last saw his wife at 10:30 the previous night when she left for work.
About 10:30 last night. He was going to get ready to go for work.
After he saw her car at 7:30, he called the hospital where she was a maternity nurse, but she hadn't shown up. Remington admitted that their 12-year marriage was rocky. They were discussing divorce, but hadn't filed the papers yet.
I called around and made a couple phone numbers. You have, by chance, have a key for the vehicle?
Dan handed the officer a key to the car and granted permission to impound it in search of clues. While it was possible that Liz's disappearance could be logically explained, missing persons cases fell under the domain of the homicide unit. They had the skills to collect and preserve every piece of potential evidence found at the scene.
Check the spare yet?
They found nothing obvious to indicate foul play and towed the car to the police garage. Any overlooked clues would be preserved in case the car required a closer look. Detectives visited a nearby convenience store, thinking that Liz might have gone there after her tire went flat. The clerk told them that she had been in the night before. She needed to break a $20 bill to make a phone call. He didn't know who she called. Police remembered that Dan Remington told them she hadn't called home.
Is that right?
It seemed reasonable to believe she may have simply run off with someone else.
She's here, walk towards the farm.
Liz's sister told police that was inconceivable. She wasn't the kind of woman who'd run from a failing marriage. No matter how bad things became, she'd never leave her children. Sergeant Dennis Brugos of the San Diego Metro Task Force found that was the consensus.
She was very devoted to her children and her family. She helped at school, she helped at Little League, and just not the type of woman that would ever walk away from her family.
Liz's sister told police it was strange that the spare tire was missing. Dan had changed the oil 2 weeks earlier and made a point of thoroughly checking the car, including the spare. Investigators took statements from the Remingtons' neighbors. Many spoke of the deteriorating relationship between Liz and Dan. The information was duly noted, but in terms of evidence that any crime had been committed, investigators had absolutely nothing. At the time of Liz Remington's disappearance, San Diego police were grappling with an apparent serial killer. Because there was no evidence that Remington had left against her will, these more violent crimes took priority.
There was no body, there was no weapon, and therefore she was simply one of many missing adults throughout this county. And at that particular time, there was actually a series of sorts that was going on where there was upwards of 40 women who were found murdered in the East County area. So certainly that would have precedent over a missing person.
4 years passed since Liz Remington's disappearance. Most of the murdered women were transients or prostitutes, so she was not considered one of the killer's victims. But when a task force was formed to look into the serial killings, her file came up too, and investigators realized she was still missing after all this time. The neighbors' taped statements and the detective reports were dusted off. Well before Liz's disappearance, they had kept a close eye on the Remingtons and helped Liz out whenever they could. Over time, friction between the couple increased, and neighbors grew concerned about her and the children. One even kept a log of what went on at the house after Liz disappeared. To demonstrate how the Remingtons' relationship had deteriorated, a neighbor told investigators about how Dan tried to sell Liz's car without her permission. According to the neighbor, Liz wasn't just surprised, she was furious. A huge fight ensued. He said that the only reason Dan didn't sell the vehicle was because Liz had the only key and wouldn't give it to him. But police recalled that on the day Liz disappeared, Dan had the key to her vehicle in his possession. Police also learned that neighbors had reported seeing Dan Remington filling in a ravine at the back of his property with a bulldozer shortly after Liz's disappearance. They said that after her disappearance, they saw him visit that part of the property every few days. He never ventured back there before she disappeared. Remarkably, because the case had never been officially closed, Liz's car had remained impounded all this time. Dan had sued to get it released, but lost. Technically, it was still considered evidence. Now it would be looked at more thoroughly. One of the first things investigators found were coins in the ashtray. Purportedly, Liz had been last seen by a convenience store clerk when she wanted change to make a phone call. The clerk's statement suggested she was okay. Now, investigators weren't so certain, since she had ample change in her car. They contacted the clerk to interview him again.
That clerk at the convenience store actually said he wasn't real sure that it was her. So that helped us to establish the fact that we didn't really know for sure whether she was there.
Suspicions of foul play had been aroused. Rugos wondered if the flat tire could have been staged. He sent the flattened tire from Liz's car to Goodyear Tire and Rubber in Akron, Ohio. Their lab is designed to evaluate the causes of tire failure.
Here?
The tire was examined on the rim.
Report was the tire was flat, it's still flat, there's definitely no...
Investigators found no outward signs of damage. Only a tiny puncture, which would have led to slow deflation. Once the leak was isolated, Product Analysis Manager Chester Patterson took the tire off its mount and examined it more thoroughly. From the looks of it, the tire went flat after the car had stopped.
We saw no damage on this tire. We saw no reason to have alerted any driver in the vehicle that something was going soft or whether the tire was deflating. Because in order to do that, the tire is beginning to come apart, and you would see that damage on the tire itself, and we saw no such damage.
But he did see something he'd never seen in his 35 years' experience. The tire removed from Liz Remington's car had been punctured from the inside out.
This tire's been punctured from the inside. See these two impressions, circular impressions, right under the punctures of the tire. And we noticed the rust that's contained in them. And it told me that somebody had taken a nail and pounded it through the inside of the tire to cause that circular nail head impressions on the liner itself.
He concluded that the tire had definitely been tampered with. 4 years after Liz Remington's disappearance, investigators had enough to get a warrant to search Dan Remington's house. They found nothing of significance inside. Outside told a different story. In the yard, a police backhoe went to work excavating the filled-in ravine.
The backhoe was probably 2 or 3 hours into the job when it hooked onto a piece of chain-link fence that was lying flat. The excavation slowed down. What we found underneath that chain-link fence was a tire.
The tire was the missing tire from Liz's car. And underneath that tire, wrapped in sheets and blankets, was the body of a female. And a missing persons investigation became a murder case.
Sir, put your hands on the counter.
Dan Remington was arrested and taken away. Officially, the body was considered a Jane Doe until a positive ID could be made. A forensic anthropologist determined the remains were those of a Caucasian female who had died of blunt trauma to the head. She had been in her late 20s to early 30s, about the same height as Liz Remington. It seemed like they had found what they were looking for, but the law required more proof than that. Forensic dentist Norman Sperber was called in.
Everything hinged on the teeth. Teeth are the most durable part of the body, and we fortunately had dental films from her dentist. We were able to take films of her teeth because they were in very good condition.
By comparing the shape and position of the victim's fillings and teeth with Liz Remington's dental records, Sperber was able to make a positive ID. Liz Remington had been found. Because the victim was discovered wrapped in bed linens, Investigators believe that Dan killed her while she was napping before work. Afterward, he carried the body out to the ravine, buried it in a shallow grave, then rented the earth-moving equipment a short time later, piling on 8 to 12 feet of dirt. Then he drove to the scene and replaced the good tire with the one he had flattened. Next morning, he reported his wife missing, confident the police would never piece it together. His unwitting accomplice was a suspected serial killer who demanded all of the police department's resources. But the clues eventually resurfaced, exposing the crime. Though Remington's exact motive will never be known, authorities believe he couldn't bear the shame of divorce or the fact that he'd lose half of his wealth and property. In October 1992, Dan Remington was found guilty of the first-degree murder of his wife. He was sentenced to life without parole. Remington went to a great deal of trouble to hide his crime. Others take an easier approach, which sometimes makes their crimes harder to solve. On September 21st, 1995, a body was discovered in a wooded area in Boise, Idaho. Plastic bags bound with duct tape encased the feet and head. From its state of decay, it had obviously been there several days. No ID was found. No attempt had been made to conceal the body. It appeared to have been hurriedly dumped there. Because of its position and wrappings, investigators couldn't even determine the victim's gender without disturbing an already disturbing scene. At this point, anything could be a clue, so the body wasn't unwrapped or inspected until it got to the morgue, where it was scrutinized under controlled conditions. The tape was carefully cut away, and the bags removed and preserved. The victim was female, around 60 years old. The coroner determined that she was strangled. She was most likely killed elsewhere, wrapped up, and transported to the woods where she was found. She fit the description of Wanda Kuzmichev, reported missing 6 days earlier. Wanda had been reported missing by her second husband, Ben Kuzmichev, when she failed to return from work. The couple had been married just 4 months. Both had retired from the large firm they worked for. Wanda took a job cleaning offices.
You are beautiful.
Thank you.
Ben, a Russian immigrant who had once been artistic director for the Idaho Ballet, now worked for a security company. After Ben reported her missing, detectives wondered if Wanda had had second thoughts about her second marriage and simply run off. But a check of her jewelry and possessions showed she'd taken nothing with her. That's never a good sign. And then her body turned up. The victim's car had not been found, so the bags she was wrapped in became the most important clue. Criminalist Cynthia Hill set to work examining them. It was all she had.
Well, in this case, we didn't have a murder weapon. There were no eyewitnesses, and the place where Wanda was found was not the murder scene. So all these things were playing against us.
Hill fumed the bags in superglue to bring out any fingerprints. The glue, contained in foil pouches, vaporizes and bonds to the print, preserving it. The print can then be dusted with powder to make it more visible. Then photographed to create a record. Hill found only one print on the bag around the victim's legs, but so far she had no one to compare it with. Ben Kuzmichev was called to the police station to provide a set of prints for comparison. In a murder investigation, it's standard procedure to get a spouse's prints.
You ever been fingerprinted before?
No, sir.
Let me do all the work, okay?
Usually, it eliminates the spouse as a suspect. In this case, that isn't quite how it worked out.
Keep this?
The print on the bag matched Ben's. That didn't necessarily mean he'd had a hand in his wife's murder. If the bag had been taken from the victim's own car, Ben might have handled it prior to its use in the crime. The print was lifted from a portion of the bag where one would normally grab it. In terms of evidence, it wasn't enough.
These people are living together. They're touching objects that one another touch. You have to be able to find a fingerprint in a location where they wouldn't normally have touched, or it's in conjunction with another piece of evidence that puts them at the scene.
Hill still believed that the bags might contain more prints. Though she didn't have the technology to lift them, she knew that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Crime Lab did. If prints were there, the Mounties could find them, or so she hoped. She carefully packed her bags, sent them to Canada, and awaited the results. While Cynthia Hill waited for her prints to come from Canada, investigators in Idaho found Wanda Kuzmichev's car. More than a week had passed since her body was discovered. The vehicle had been abandoned in a store parking lot 4 miles from where she was found. Police processed the vehicle for fingerprints. They raised 2 prints from the trunk lid. Their placement suggested they were left by the person closing the trunk. Inside, investigators found something surprising. Nothing at all. For Detective David Smith of the Boise, Idaho Police Department, that was a significant discovery.
In talking with the family members, they said that she would always carry her Jehovah's Witness literature in the trunk. In fact, they said you could not put anything in her trunk because it was so full.
But the trunk wasn't entirely empty. Investigators found a single drop of blood. It belonged to the victim. Whoever had put her in the trunk had also left fingerprints on the gear shift knob. Prints on the trunk and on the gear shift matched Ben Kuzmichev. Investigators faced the same challenges as before. The car belonged to Ben's wife. It stood to reason that he could leave his fingerprints on it. Still, it seemed strange that his were the only clear prints found, especially since he told police that as far as he knew, Wanda was the last person to drive the vehicle. The evidence suggested that Ben drove it last, leaving behind the clearest prints.
Tests were conducted to show that in approximately 70% of all cases, the last person who drives the car and activates the gear shift lever will destroy the person's prints who drove the car prior to and leave their prints on the gear shift lever.
The prints made detectives 70% sure that Ben Kuzmichev was lying. That wasn't good enough. An inspection of the car seat disclosed another clue.
I knew Wanda's stature in that she was 5'4" and 140 pounds. When I looked at the seat, it appeared to me to be back farther than usual for a woman of that stature to be driving the vehicle. So I placed a female of 5'4", 140 pounds inside the vehicle. She was unable to reach the pedals, which appeared to be a comfortable driving position. Conversely, I put a male matching Ben's description, 5'11", 190 pounds, into the driver's seat, and they fit very comfortable.
The experiment provided more circumstantial proof that Ben was a liar, but it still didn't prove he was a murderer. By now, the Canadian Royal Mounted Police Lab had performed their tests on the trash bag used to wrap the body of Wanda Kuzmichev. The test, called vacuum metal deposition, is a state-of-the-art method for lifting difficult prints from plastic. The bag was placed in a vacuum chamber and then pelted with ions of gold, which cling to the plastic but not to the oily prints. Then it's exposed to ionized zinc, which clings only to the gold, leaving the prints untouched and in contrast against the plastic. The process revealed a second print on the bag. According to Cynthia Hill, the position of this print was far more incriminating.
The second fingerprint that was developed using the vacuum metal deposition proved that he had a direct contact with that bag because the positioning of the hand was in such a way that he would be grabbing the plastic bag, wrapping the tape around Wanda, and he would be the only one that would be leaving the fingerprint in that position at that time.
In most cases, that would be enough to win a conviction. But investigators weren't so sure. Proving a spousal murder on fingerprints alone would be a hard sell. The prints and other evidence they'd gathered gave them enough to get a search warrant for the Kuzmichevs' home. They found no signs that this was the murder scene. But they did find the Jehovah's Witness literature that the victim's family said she never removed from her car. The items presented more circumstantial evidence that Ben had been involved in the murder. By January 1996, 4 months after the crime, investigators were still building their case against Ben Kuzmichev.
Detective!
He began to feel the circle of evidence closing in on him, and he announced he was going back to Russia. At that point, police had no choice but to charge him with Wanda's murder.
I'd let me go.
If he returned to Russia, he'd be a free man, beyond U.S. extradition. Though they had enough to arrest him, they weren't certain they had a solid case for murder in the first. Between the time of his arrest and the trial date, investigators continued to gather evidence against Kuzmichev. Under surveillance in jail, he couldn't make a move without authorities knowing about it.
We placed monitoring devices on approximately 17 phones inside the jail at the Ada County Jail. That gave us the ability to monitor his conversations as outgoing as well as whoever he was seeing as a visitor. The end result was that we received nothing that could be used in court. Nothing incriminating came about the phone calls.
But help came from an unlikely source. Kuzmichev had confided details of his crime to his cellmate. The prisoner, disturbed by Kuzmichev's lack of remorse, reported the details to authorities. He had nothing to gain by doing so.
Ben and his cellmate were watching TV one evening when the news media broadcast that we had located a witness who had told us that she had, in fact, sold Ben duct tape and trash bags. The inmate told us that Ben found this humorous, that he had, in fact, purchased from this lady, but they were not the ones that we were looking for that he used in the crime.
The inmate's information, though hearsay, provided one more strike against Ben Kuzmichev. Investigators realized they'd gathered all they were going to get. They weren't sure they had enough. But because Ben was likely to be released and flee to Russia, they had to take the case to trial. From what police could put together, 4 months after their marriage, Ben and Wanda's honeymoon was over. He had been dependent on her money, but wanted to return to his homeland. She refused to go. Their animosity built, and Ben strangled her. He wrapped her body in plastic bags, emptied the trunk of her car, loaded her in, and dumped her in the woods. Then he abandoned the car in the parking lot. Based on the accumulated evidence, Ben Kuzmichev was convicted for the second-degree murder of his wife, Wanda, and sentenced to 21 years to life. For Detective David Smith, solving this case meant more than simply delivering justice.
You do become personally involved. I mean, this guy has come to your town, committed this heinous act, and now you have this grieving family that you want to do everything in your power to solve this case for. And that's how I personally take it, and I know any other seasoned homicide detective will tell you the same thing.
When spouse kills spouse, the clues are sometimes difficult to read. But the marriage of forensic science with good detective work can bring together what the killer had tried to put asunder.